Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back in Newport Room for the second breakout session of the defense track. We are starting a bit earlier, 5 minutes earlier, due to the fact that we already have a full room. Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe let's start from the beginning. I would like to invite Mr. Janusz Onyszkiewicz, former Minister of National Defense of the Republic of Poland, the moderator of this panel. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I will not sort of give long introductory remarks. We have not that much time, and you came here to listen to panelists, not to me. So I would like to ask the members of the panel to come and join me here. We have fairly distinguished persons. Thank you. And if you would agree with me, I will just will skip the introduction of all panelists. There are sort of not names and functions, but also short stories are in the booklet. So we'll just start right away. Thank you. So, well, the title of this debate is 3 Seats, 1 Threat, and the question is, what could be the threat which will make all these 3 seats one operational area, or is this operational area just confined to these 3 seats in a situation when we have a very major contingency? And to kick off our discussion, I would like to ask Mr. Minister to give us sort of a more or less general overview of the situation, addressing specifically this issue. And my only request is, and plea is, to be rather short, because we have only 1 hour. So, Minister, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me say it's a pleasure to be here at the Warsaw Security Forum. It's the first time for me. And on this panel on deterrence in the 3 maritime areas, the sea regions of the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean, to which I will, I have to say, add a 4th. As you know, Norwegians have always been a seafaring people. However, I would say that the rough seas outside our shores have not been a barrier to the outside world, but more of a connector. And that is also, of course, the situation and the case for the Baltic, Black, and the Mediterranean seas. And in that perspective, it is very fitting to see them as constituting regions in their own right. And this is, of course, acknowledged by NATO in its comprehensive regional security assessments. And it also bears repeating that Russia is, of course, facing us in all 3 or even 4 regions. And I would say that while it is important to analyze and recognize the specifics of each region, we must not lose sight of the connections between the various regions that make up the alliance. And the 360-degree approach needs to be much more than a slogan, as it reflects a very stark geopolitical fact, that the security of NATO depends on the security of each individual ally, and that any conceivable large-scale crisis or conflict will not be isolated to one region alone. That being said, where you stand obviously depends on where you sit, and Eastern allies have very specific and legitimate concerns that we, as an alliance, should fully take on board, and which are intrinsically linked to our own. Norway's consistent and significant contribution to the EFP is a concrete manifestation of those concerns. So, the Baltic, Black, and Mediterranean seas largely delineate the outer limits of the European continent to the south and to the east. There is, however, an other sea area of equal importance to the north and the west, the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic is key to bringing Allied reinforcements to Europe in a crisis or war, and therefore of key importance to the defense of the entire continent. Keeping the sea lines of communications open in the event of crisis is not only important for northern or western allies, but for the security of the alliance as such. At the same time, we see that Russia's strategic deterrence, especially its strategic ballistic submarines, is based on or operates from the Kola Peninsula. And for this reason, in any major crisis or conflict, it will be crucial for Russia to ensure what it calls its bastion defense, all the way down to the Guyuk Gap. This is, as you know, a concept of forward defense, projecting layered sea control, sea denial, and disruption into the North Atlantic and the Northern Oceans. So command of the North Atlantic is of crucial importance both to NATO and Russia. As it is well known, Russia is also developing its military infrastructure in the north and increasing its military activity, and has demonstrated significant increase in its strategic mobility in the region. In the maritime domain, new surface combatants, and especially submarines, in combination with highly improved missile technology, pose clear challenge to us all. For years, Norway has worked to increase NATO situational awareness in the North Atlantic and to enhance its presence and readiness in the area. We are very pleased with the adaptation of NATO's command structure, which will significantly, I think, increase the alliance's capabilities and ability to conduct large operations, not only in the North Atlantic, but in the whole maritime domain, as well as the new maritime doctrine. I would hasten to add that we do not see Russian military capabilities in the north as being specifically directed against Norway, but they do, however, pose a serious strategic challenge to NATO for the reasons mentioned above. And that assessment has been driving the development of the Norwegian armed forces over the last years, focusing on significant contributions to the alliance situational awareness, presence and capability in the north and in the maritime domain, investing in strategic capabilities that both enhance our national defense and contributes to NATO's overall deterrence, not only regionally, but in the, the 360 degrees approach. We do this in collaboration with other allies. One example is the German-Norwegian new strategic partnership on submarines, procurement, but also opening up a potential for comprehensive strategic cooperation on training and education, exercises, maintenance, and logistics. F-35 and MPA cooperation with the UK can serve as a second example, and also, of course, with missile technology and the NSM with Poland. I would also say that training exercises, such as the ongoing Trident Juncture exercise, is an excellent opportunity for training the collective defense in our region, for building a credible deterrence posture. And we greatly appreciate the broad and extensive participation of our allies and partners. This is an exercise involving more than 50,000 troops. They are gathering in Norway as we speak, and it is in fact NATO's largest exercise in this region for more than a generation. In parallel, just to add from the Norwegian perspective, we attach great importance to maintaining as low a possible level of tension in the north. Predictability and transparency are key words in our relations with Russia in the region, and our bilateral dialogue and practical cooperation contribute to the stability of the region. And as several NATO summits has confirmed, we believe that effective and enhanced deterrence must be balanced with substantive dialogue. We believe that predictability and transparency should also be key words in the Baltic, Mediterranean, and Black Sea regions. And while Russia clearly does not always act in accordance with best practice or even international obligations, it is in our own interests to act responsibly, even more relevant in regions where Allied and Russian forces are operating in close proximity, as we see, for example, in the Baltic and the Black Seas. And such an approach also helps denying them building a narrative of an unpredictable and aggressive NATO alliance, and should be a building block in our own strategic communication. So to sum up, for NATO's deterrence to be credible and effective, we need to see the clear linkage between the regions and the directional thinking. This needs to encompass the Baltic, the Black and the Mediterranean seas, but also the North and the West. So let's get real about the 360-degree approach. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for brevity. Well, Baltic actually is not sort of a NATO area. There are countries which are not NATO members. So in case of contingency, what should be the role of these countries? How EU should sort of respond? Commander, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think if you look at at the Baltic coastal states, there are 9 and 8 of them are EU members already. And out of these 8, we have 6 NATO members. So if you look at the strategic situation, I think the Western countries are in a good position, in a strong position. And of course, if you compare it to the Cold War, there's quite a difference to the former situation. So I think that is relatively clear. Given the fact that Russia is obviously rearming the Kaliningrad Oblast, I think there's a current threat. And if we look at this threat, we have the Russian A2AD capabilities which are reinforced. We have shore-based missile systems, but we also have a very good Russian submarine force. And I think, Minister Halvorsen just mentioned it, I think we also need to strengthen NATO's and EU's submarine and ASW capabilities. And that is what we are currently doing in this cooperation between Germany and Norway, for example. But there are other corporations, and I think if you see the Baltic Sea, there's a Baltic Commanders Conference where not only the Western countries of the Baltic coastal states cooperate, but it's also including other navies from the entire northern flank of NATO. So I think it is of course cooperation between those countries, improve interoperability and improve our capabilities, and that is to come from a strong position, from a strong geostrategic position, and to have a good show of force.
Thank you. Admiral, now there is a question to you. Well, we always discuss about so-called Suwalki corridor and the access to land access to Baltic states. So what Navy could do to secure the other alternative, the access through sea, or to deny Russians access to Kaliningrad region? Admiral.
Yes, thank you. 1, 2. Yeah, it's the. Yes, is the first of all, I think it's a brilliant idea to address this free sea approach, and because usually we focus on just one sea, and the free sea approach showing to us that today any threat somewhere in the world is impact our national interest, all of us, and the Western country we are. Is that the reason of the NATO alliance is so strong? Is we are able to address any threat has an impact on the global security, and to be able to defend. We took a very important decision the last Brussels summit in the NATO, deciding to create a third JFC. And attached to the Second Fleet in the Norfolk, and that will increase the ability to cooperate all together between NATO's navies. And it's already we are have pretty good results, and we already talk about the long-range bombers. Russia is flying around the Europe. We already talk about the submarines, nuclear Russian submarines, also coming, from the North Sea up down to the Mediterranean Sea, and we are organized as all the navy from NATO to track this nuclear submarine during their transit from Russia to Mediterranean Sea. So it's important for the NATO navies to pursue their development of the new capabilities with means in numbers enough, and also high technologies to be able to assess and counter the threat coming from Russia.
Okay, now so let's go on now more to the south. After all, we have two separate seas. One is Baltic, linked obviously with North Sea and Atlantic, and the Black Sea, which is quite sort of separate entity. Are there some sort of scenarios in which a conflict could be rather local, could be confined to Black Sea? What kind of scenario could that be? And what NATO or European Union could do in a situation when there will be sort of a development and some sort of problems, between Russia and Ukraine? Well, I would like to ask Mr. Dindal.
First of all, I'm working at NATO, but I'm young colonel. I'm not a policymaker or a general. And we work in a kind of a think tank that pokes ideas, challenge policy and challenge posture of NATO. And I'm also academic, so I must say that this is for me and not for NATO position. Absolutely, sadly, in a sense, that a conflict could be limited to that region, and it's already do. We see that. We saw that with Georgia, we saw that with Ukraine, and we still see that. And also the situation in the Baltic or the Black Sea is very different than in the High North and in the Baltic Sea, as you say, that where NATO and Sweden and Finland is very strong, actually, compared to, say, the Cold War. In the Black Sea, it's very different. NATO is in a weak position in the Black Sea, and that is important to bring into the equation of policy and political options for what to do. So, in a sense, political responsibilityness, I don't think that NATO should be in a position to push too hard on Russia on different issues in that region. Because if we are not ready to stand by on a political and military sense, we should be cautious about doing that. What we see today is NATO not involved. If something else happens, if it's kind of escalates, I think we will see a different situation. I still do not see that NATO will get directly involved. Contrary to many critics today talking about cohesion, challenges to cohesion in NATO, I think that been grown very strong over the last couple of years, since Ukraine and especially over the last couple of years, cohesion. But it's limited also to the 29. So it's very clear also at the same time that it's a great skepticism about dealing with other things than Article 5 and the 29. So NATO, I'm not too positive to a concrete military involvement in such a case. But I do think that, of course, you will see EU and NATO doing condemnation, doing all you can do politically. And I also think that we will see nations stepping up and getting involved in Ukraine if it escalates in Ukraine today.
Thank you. Well, my last question will be to Mr. Melcher. What about Turkey? After all, Turkey is a very militarily powerful country. If we take, if I'm not mistaken, and Admiral and others may probably correct me if I'm mistaken, but the Turkish fleet is quite strong. So obviously, although we are not as NATO in such a strong position versus as we are in Baltic, but nevertheless, it is not that we are completely sort of defenseless, but there is also a political question: to what extent we can count on very close cooperation with Turkey in case of some contingency there, taking into account certain rapprochement between Turkey and Russia.
Well, it's an interesting question. Do we have a liberal democracy, or do we have an illiberal democracy in Turkey? And what can we expect? Certainly in the Black Sea, they consider themselves to be as strong as anyone, although at the moment Russia is at least verbally challenging them for that leadership on the water in the Black Sea. The likelihood of a coalition, I mean, it's the concern, for example, as we talked about in the Baltic Sea, I mean, we have a lot of good navies, all allies, all willing to work together. You don't have, as you said, the same situation here. So, the strength of Romania isn't that strong on the water. Ukraine has just their Mosquito fleet. So really it just comes down to if something's going to happen there to stand up to them, it's going to have to be Turkey. I personally, in the latest, pulling in the latest incident with Saudi Arabia, we see, in my view, Turkey stepping up to the plate as a liberal democracy, calling it as they see it. Hey, this is what really happened. So I think when push comes to shove, they're going to be on the right side with NATO here, and they will stand up to Russia. It's also a particular concern as we see what's happening in the Azov at the moment and the increasing aggressive actions by Russia. Now, it's mostly all non-kinetic things, but just things like the inspections of civilian vessels in the Azov Sea has gone up an order of magnitude in just just this year. So there's concerns up there which probably would not be an area you would see Turkey going. So that would need some other type of solution.
Thank you. Well, now I would like to ask other members of the panel, do you want to comment on what has been said by the others? Admiral.
Yeah, I would just like to start about the NATO is doing something in the Black Sea. Just we have developed the Taylor forward presence, which is the ability to increase the number of ships going inside the Black Sea. We have also the ability to develop, to increase the number of maritime patrol aircraft operating from NATO countries to the Black Sea. But also, one point is in this rivalry with Russia and NATO, the policy is first of all, is the defense, which means that we need to have means all together to be able to face the Russian military means. The second is to deter, and the third is dialogue. And deter, so which means that we are a nuclear deterrence alliance, and so we are not in a way we are facing Russia with a huge amount of means in the border from the east, Europe, and to the south, but is just maintain enough means to be able to defend ourselves, but also to deter Russia to attack the NATO countries.
Yeah, thank you. It's not directly a comment to any of the other interventions, but I've been reflecting a bit about the Sulaki report also presented this morning and discussions we had. And what I see in NATO is maybe one of the more kind of dangerous security logics today is in the Baltic Sea, even though we kind of stressed, a couple of us, that we are in a strong position in a sense in the Baltic Sea, but at the same time it is extremely dangerous. It is underappreciated in the NATO headquarters of many reasons. So I can go into those if you have questions on that later, but the situation I see, the logic which is so dangerous, is that Russia is a very strong military. They're strong on their western border, absolutely, and we have seen they're securing their A2AD and their presence in the Kaliningrad, and we see at the same time that they are so dependent on this, and at the same time they are in a vulnerable position. So they need to act in a very early stage of a conflict to be able to kind of secure its own area, to secure its belly, to put it that way. This is the closest area to the Moscow. And also to be able to oppose sea denial up on the Baltic Sea. If they secure the Kaliningrad, they will be able to do that. But they need surprise. And that makes this situation so dangerous because they're in a vulnerable, weaker position, but at the same time have strong forces close by. So this is a kind of underappreciated scenario, which I would like to see more discussions on in NATO, actually.
Well, I think, as several of the other panelists have mentioned as well, I think our response to the challenges we are seeing is it's so closely linked, because to address some of these challenges we are facing in all the maritime domain, and not only in the maritime domain, but linking the regions of the Baltic, the Sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and also the North Atlantic. I think we need the understanding of the threat. We need the policies to address them. We need the structure and the capabilities to implement those policies. And I would argue that NATO has come a long way in all of those aspects over the last years, but from a very low starting point, I would argue. We have now the new maritime command. We have the re-establishment of the US Second Fleet. We have a new maritime doctrine. We are having allies reinvesting in substantial maritime capabilities, and also, as the commander mentioned, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which were basically scrapped after the Cold War and which we have had to rebuild from nothing, more or less. But we are seeing the re-establishment also of a lot of the cooperation structures that we had during the Cold War in the bilateral frameworks, in the trilateral frameworks, and also in NATO as such. So I would argue that we are at a much better point than we were just 2 or 3 years ago, but there's still a long way to go to address the complexity of this new threat environment and the capabilities we are facing from a potential opponent.
I just want to add another aspect, which is if we look at this eastern region, the eastern flank, everybody speaks, it's very land-centric. Everybody speaks about enhanced forward presence, VJTF and so forth, but the Navy is not really visible. And I'd like to remind everybody of the standing naval forces NATO has to be present in the Baltics, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I think they have a quite important task. But the composition of these standing naval forces does not reflect this task, and I think we need to foster these standing forces, which are in fact the very high readiness forces of the navies in NATO.
Yes, I'd like to add 3 quick comments. The first is I stood in this exact position a year ago and briefed out on a Baltic maritime simulation we conducted. Now that was focused on Sweden and Poland and the idea of Poland potentially buying 4 submarines. But what came out of that was a more general conclusion of if all the countries there did operate their submarines together in a flotilla, there are a lot of risks that can't be taken today. If you only have 2 or 3 submarines, what risks can you really take? But if everyone did operate in a flotilla and the power of a submarine, the fear of a surface warfare on the Russian side, the fact that there's a submarine they don't know on the bottom of the Baltic has a very chilling effect on what their capabilities might be. The second thing, if I jump back to the Black Sea for 1 second, one thing to keep in mind is you throw a ship or 2 in there from NATO, that's great, but you can almost view Crimea as an aircraft carrier sitting down there at the bottom. They've got S-300, S-400 capability there. They have the Iskander missile. If you just start drawing rings of ranges, they pretty much can control most of that area from there. So even with an aggressive posture on the NATO side in terms of the surface of submarine fleet in that region, it's still a challenge. And Crimea alone has to be dealt with to really to take it beyond that. Last, I guess a concern about NATO in the Mediterranean, and this is just a fact I picked up from the naval folks in Naples about a month ago. In the Cold War in the Mediterranean, on a typical day, there were 90 Russian ships in the Med and 66 U.S. and Allied ships. On the day that I got this fact, about a month ago, there were 28 Russian ships in the Mediterranean. There were 2 U.S. vessels and 6 total vessels, including U.S. allies in NATO. So it's the balance of power there is still an area of big concern, and I don't think we're really quite matching up to what we see going on.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks a lot. Well, I think that these 2 areas, I mean, Baltic and Black Sea, are different in this aspect, that contingency to NATO in Black Sea will be mostly sort of stemming from sort of naval action, because there is no common border. Well, in Baltic it could be different. It could be different, and that's why it is not very closely related to the naval aspects. But nevertheless, I think in the Baltic states, in the Baltic area, in case of some conflict, you know what really it could be quite a challenging thing, despite of recent declaration of President Putin that they will never use first the nuclear weapons. The concept of de-escalation with tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think that in a situation when Russians would like to freeze their gains, declaring that any kind of attempt to change the achieved status quo would result in their sort of nuclear, response? Is this scenario likely to materialize, or is Navy has any role to play to sort of confront this aspect? Who would volunteer? Well, so I will hang this question then in the air. Okay, sorry. So now we can turn to the audience. Are there some questions? I'm sorry, I cannot see. Oops. Okay.
Yeah, Werner Fasslabend, President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and the former Defense Minister. My question goes beyond the three Cs. If I look to the global development, I would say the most important theater for maritime questions will be the Indo-Pacific, and this in a really fast development. And if I look to the situation in South China Sea on the one hand, and to the Western Indo-Pacific on the other hand, I ask the question, where are European interests, where are European forces? Already now, half of the world container traffic goes through the Indian Ocean, 70% of all the oil transports. And the development goes so fast because also the demographic development will be in this area. And insofar, I ask myself the question, are we not concentrated too much on our very small questions and problems in the one or in the other small sea? And do we not overlook the big questions that will come up to us at the latest 1 or 1.5 decades?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question too, because the Indo-Pacific challenge for us is the obvious, just because we are, like you say, we have economic dependence on the what's happened in South Asia. So France has the permanent naval base just because we have the overseas territories, so they are European overseas territory. We are in the. We already talked this morning about the PESCO initiative, and the inside the PESCO we have the launch a new initiative. Is about the new project is about the share the overseas base. So it's something we can share with European country. We are concentrating also with close cooperations with our close ally in the Indo-Pacific area, of course with Australia. We are developing a partnership with Australia, but also with India. We have a strategic maritime dialogue with India. The main idea is to be able to share first the maritime domain awareness and what's the maritime informations, share the information so we can be able to share, what's the of course the white shipping informations, but of course the gray area and the black information between the people you do some traffickings, and but also the maybe try to be able to survey what are exactly the ships transiting in the Indo-Pacific area. We are also exercising the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. We are not the only country to do it. Of course, the US and the Japanese and all the country around the Asia are exercising this freedom of navigation. Some of them are we call the FONOPS, which means that they are entering the closed sea around the small islands that the China are building in the South China Sea. So it's a concern for all of us, just because, like I said before, today with our global economy, we are all impacted if something happens in this area. So it's good to raise this topic here, just because it's something we are all concerned, and the French defense minister in the last Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore called for more European navies deployed in the Indo-Pacific area, just because I think it's our interest, all European countries, to be present in this area. Thank you.
Anybody else want to comment? Yeah.
Yes, I can pitch in on that. Indo-Pacific is absolutely something we are also looking at. NATO is not taking very much a position or a stand on it, but it's very much discussed. And to draw some main points on it, the US is still the naval superpower for many years, 2 decades probably. We're talking a lot about China Naval. China Naval is big. During the Cold War, even it had 1,000 warships. So it was big, and it still is big. And it's modernizing, it's building quite fast, but still it is a regional power. It's very underestimated. The Japanese naval forces, they are huge, they are great, much greater than European in total. What China will become is not clear yet. We have a couple of aircraft carriers in the line coming out. What is the future? We still do not know. They need to develop another navy to be able to do more about on the global scene, or the Indo-Pacific, going into the Indian Ocean at least. The logistics are not in place. Carrier forces to support that at the level of a superpower is at least 15 years away still. Europe need to wake up to this. We need to have more presence, but sending 1 or 2 ships, it's not going to do much. We need to realize that the European navies are not blue ocean navies, so we need to do something about that in Europe. That is the discussion we should take, because we see where China can be in 15 years, not before that, but we have choices to make as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you. Well, I would like to draw this line of questioning and ask about the Arctic. After all, Russia is building sort of a special military sort of structure for Arctic. So what is really the purpose? Is there any sort of danger that, the debate about, how to use Arctic, how to use the sea routes going through that area, could that also create certain problems and certain, not only controversies, but also conflict, and how to cope with that?
I'll take a shot at that. I just came from a littoral operational technical workshop last week in Halifax, and you'll be glad to know there was a substantial number of Norwegians there. And it was a technical kind of review of a bunch of panels, but we overdrapped that with a scenario of Svalbard up to the north and the things that can happen with that. And you could really see the potential areas of conflict that can emerge. And it's surprising when you look at it. It's not just Russia concerned with how they can control the region, but China now is very interested in a lot of issues in the Arctic. The opportunity for whether you believe global warming or not, whether you believe in it or not, there's definitely things are melting up there. So there's a lot more access. The access to minerals and oil is driving an increased intention. And, excuse me. And getting back to your comment about thinking about China, what's on their plate is the fact that there can now be a northern route from some part of the year with the right set of icebreakers where they can save roughly 40 to 50% of the shipping time. So all this is kind of coming together in what I would call a new north. It's kind of, what's old is now new again, and the GI-UK gap, that line really is moving northward, and the challenges will be in that region in the future.
Thank you. Over there.
Hi.
Sorry, Mr. Minister.
Just a few comments on the Arctic question, which is, of course, one that we follow and participate in very, very closely. Let me start by saying a few things on the sort of overarching political level, because I would say, in general, we see the Arctic still as an area with relatively low tension on the military side. We see it as an area where the political dialogue between the Arctic states is rather well functioning, I would say, even in the current environment, including with Russia in the Arctic Council and in the other formats of cooperation. And we see it as an area where there is genuine agreement between the Arctic states, and so far they have all adhered to it, that the framework of the law of the seas will regulate any disagreements on territorial claims, for example, between the countries. And so far, all the claims have been sent to the UN Commission on the territorial shelf claims. And you have, for example, the Ilulissat Declaration from 2008, where the Arctic coastal states agreed to respect the law of the seas. So I would argue, yes, we are seeing increased attention, we are seeing increased activity, but I think this narrative on the race to the Arctic is it's a hyperbole, so to say, so far. We are seeing military developments, which are of concern to us. I mentioned some of them in my initial remarks. And we should follow those very closely, because those are potentially strategic challenges to NATO and to the transatlantic states. But we should be able to also to engage Russia, I think, in a constructive manner on issues of mutual interest in the North. We have been able to do so bilaterally from Norway's side and also in the multilateral frameworks so far. And I think that is a clear aim among all the Arctic states. That being said, as I mentioned, of course, the Kola Peninsula is the home base of most of the Russian strategic, especially second strike capabilities. They are very keen on defending that in any major crisis scenario, and that has security implications, of course, for the whole of the region. And that is why we need to be vigilant. We need to build our situational awareness in the Arctic and the High North. And we are seeing, I would say, a renewed interest and strengthened capabilities, both from our side and from key allies' side in that perspective.
Thank you. There was a question over there, I think.
Yeah, I think it was me. This is not working, is it? Is this working? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Tytti Eraste from SIPRI, the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, and I wanted to ask about the role of the Aegis destroyers in the defense and deterrence strategy of these three regions, because 4 of those ships were brought to the Mediterranean as part of the EPAA, the missile defense plan of NATO, starting in 2010. But since then, there have been some incidents in the Baltic and the Black Seas where the Russians were busing the destroyer that was on the sea. And I was wondering what kind of role do they have in those regions, and does it mean that the missile defense mission of those ships has changed since some years ago?
Well, who will take this question? Admiral?
No, not really. I can't talk about, or I don't know whether the role of the naval ships in the BMD system also have changed. So I do not have knowledge of that either from the US perspective or from NATO. So I'm sorry.
Maybe I just can add something about the Aegis, the cruiser, and they are more about the theater defense missile, so they can be a project in the area where we are under a ballistic missiles threat. In fact, I think in the Baltic is not the case today, and so it is not in the plan of the US, but maybe you should add something in about the US policy. But about NATO is not something we plan already to do. Call for these ships to be deployed somewhere to prevent from the ballistic missile attack. So they will be more useful in the area where there is some coalitions, military forces deployed, like in the Arabic Peninsula, and but it's not the case, I think, in the Baltic Sea.
I think I just add that I think this is more of a freedom of navigation issue, as we do in the South China Sea. The same thing going into the Black Sea. It just happens to be that an Aegis ship is the one that we have the most of, and that is typically the one that would go into there. I'm not sure that the missile defense aspects were necessarily the driving function for why they were there, but I'm not fully informed either.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sorry. Oh, well. So, well, if there is no questions, so some final comments from you? Oh, over there. Sorry.
Johannes Ahlefeld. The question would be, what is your take on the Polish Trimare initiative?
Yeah, Trimare, you mean the 3C initiative, more linked with economy, is my opinion, or my impression on that? Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. It's been discussions on that. I've seen that in Brussels, both from, say, seminars, especially around the EU, because it's more a EU and a German kind of a critique have been about these issues for the last couple of years when it came about. That turned a bit before the summit this year, I saw. So this is not something that NATO is following, but I just saw it in the sidelines. I think it's quite important development, actually, and I'm very positive to that kind of development, also within the defense sector, and it goes into some of the questions that was in some of the panels earlier today on energy security and resilience, and that goes into defense, absolutely. So it's not been, as of my knowledge, it's not been an issue within NATO at all, but I'm following it, and others are doing that as well. So I hope for some developments on that, and I think the EU and Germany is coming around on this one. It would be very strange if they kind of object too obviously in the future on that one, I think. So I hope it moves forward.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, over there, yeah.
Thank you, Nina Rusidze. When you talked about the further development of the naval forces of the NATO, do you include the future port building in Georgia and Anaklia in the Black Sea region, or it's out of the development for the NATO? It's just the member states or the partner countries are included too? Thank you.
Well, who is somehow familiar with this issue? Not really. Well, so I would like to ask you something like this. After all, there is a problem with Azov Sea. There is a problem because, well, there is a certain agreement between Ukraine and Russia how to handle the shipping in the Azov Sea, which is not very much in full compliance with the open sea, with the open sea principles. In case Ukraine would complain about the problems with access to, especially to Mariupol, which is economically so important to Ukraine, well, is there any role for European Union, or well, probably more for European Union, maybe for, but also maybe for NATO to play? Could that be? Would that be a good idea to test Russians by sending a ship to Mariupol, for example, hoping that Russia would not dare to try to somehow inspect this ship? What do you think about it?
I can try, and also goes to the former question a little bit, and I will try to go back to what you commented on Crimea. It's the kind of the fixed carrier, and that goes into the vulnerability of naval or of any Western or NATO or Western countries' naval ships in the Black Sea region. So, of course, I think NATO would, and nations would, send single ships as kind of a diplomacy type of mission, but you would be very, very careful to do this in a scenario where it's actually you're feeling threatened as of a naval conflict, because you are so vulnerable. I see more likely that you will see support on ground. That can be made more secure for NATO forces or allied forces, rather than having naval shipping inside the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, with the prospects of a conflict. Simply too dangerous, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, over there, sorry.
Thank you. I have a slightly more mainstream question, perhaps. I agree with you that the maritime dimension in NATO has sort of been the poor cousin, perhaps, and has not received sufficient attention, but now we are looking at the standing naval force and how we can strengthen it. Do you have any suggestions on, what should be the next steps in that regard, that we actually have an appropriate maritime posture as well? And perhaps you could also comment on the aspect of reinforcement, especially the reinforcement across the Atlantic. What are the requirements that we should be looking at from that perspective? Thank you.
I could try on the naval forces. I think in the past there's been the issue that the naval standing naval forces have been misused to cover any fourth generation problems NATO had. So we used these forces for Ocean Shield, for Operation Active Endeavour. That is one issue, and the other issue or the other problem is that many NATO members prefer to fulfill national tasks instead of using or instead of filling these standing naval forces. So, at least from my experience, I can say you need to create an exercise environment that there's an incentive for nations to send ships to these naval forces, that you put ships for a couple of months in these forces and they come out with a good benefit in the key capabilities like ASW and other stuff. And I think that is important to stress this, and then I hope at some stage these naval forces will be filled as they should be.
Thank you. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, just I can add that with the new the last commitment from the NATO country to increase their budget by 2% of GDP, and it's we are now in a new area where we are developing more, our means inside the NATO country. So we can see there is some new program for frigates, for submarine among the NATO countries. So in the future, we will see more power on the maritime issue from the NATO countries. So that's very important. And I think we should maintain this strategy to invest in the in maritime means, just because the one of the core the force from NATO is with the unity of NATO, to be able to, with the Article 5, each of us defend the other country, and which means that each country is able first to operate some frigates or submarines efficient enough to counter the threat from the enemy. And also we are developing the new doctrine to be able to operate all together. So if I refer to the question about the Georgia and Ukraine, it's just because today the NATO countries are working all together, trained together. We talk about the standing naval force. It's a way also to be able to operate together, to train together, and to be more efficient together.
Yes, I would like to add to that a little bit as well. It was a very good question, and actually a lot have happened over the last couple of years on this decisions. It hasn't come to bear yet, but just coming out with the new command structure, getting a maritime headquarter, getting someone to care at a higher level about the maritime issues was a very, very strong signal. And also picking up on the maritime strategy and poster that was back from 2010. And it was a very, very different situation around since 2014, and that has not been reflected. That has been the maritime poster and strategy still today is, with the very much focus on the softer side of maritime roles and challenges. And also, I think we will see, and we've already seen that in several of the nations, a greater focus on hard capabilities, especially with ASW, as was mentioned by the Secretary, and also missile defense, missile for defense, not in ballistic missile defense, but for naval ships. It needs to be developed, and that has been reckoned in NATO already, and it's on the way, but it takes time for that to come to bear.
Thank you. Oops, sorry. I can't see any other. Oh, sorry. These lights are so over there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Stanislav Raščan. I'm head of Department for Strategic Studies and Analysis at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. And first of all, I would like to thank you, Minister Halovin, for bringing the Mediterranean as a fourth sea and others in. And I would like somehow to connect the Three Seas initiative with today's discussion, since Slovenia is the next one organizing meeting of the presidents as a main initiative of the Three Seas initiative. Croatia was, beside Poland, also very much involved in this initiative. And we have not only now presidents from 12 countries, we have some ministers from Germany, from United States, minister at the last meeting of the president. We had the president of the EU Commission, so it seems that everybody is on board. But yes, for the time being, we are discussing infrastructural projects which can be also connected to NATO security, defense, and so on. Energy, when we are almost always saying about the safety, energy safety, and so on. So if you would like, or if you would like to add some more security defense in the 3C initiative, please let us know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, any comments? No. If not, that, what can we say after all this debate? Clearly, it looks like the role and the requirements for naval forces are obviously of quite different nature than for ground forces in the case of some contingencies, especially in these three areas. But they are different. There are different scenarios, possible scenarios in the Black Sea, what may happen there and what kind of requirements will be put forward to naval forces. In Baltic, there will be clearly a big problem of securing some sort of sea link to Baltic states, but the main challenge obviously would be to secure the free passage across Atlantic as it was, unfortunately, during Cold War period. There are also other problems in more distant areas like in Pacific, on the north, but that obviously would sort of go beyond the area which we are basically concentrating on. So it's not a sort of a summing up of our discussion, just a couple of final remarks. I would like to thank all panelists for their presentation, and I think we would show our appreciation by a round of applause.